Good afternoon, it's Wednesday the 21st of June 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're delighted to be joined by Alex Thompson with Eastern Approaches. And of course, Alex will be speaking from the Netherlands, where I understand it's also hot. It's been truly amazing that the UK column could put on the news today because we've had hot weather in UK.
Well, this is a period of amber alert, level 3 warnings for hot weather. And of course, that's only one level down from a level 4 national emergency. So the BBC this morning thought it was probably best to speak to the soldiers that would be protecting the House of Lords for the opening of Parliament today. And so they spent about 10 minutes asking a commander who had spent time in 50-degree heat in Afghanistan what he and his men would be doing to protect themselves from the 23, 24 degrees heat that they would be experiencing today, because otherwise they might faint.
So it's just a wonder that the country can actually function today, because it is quite hot.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'd just like to say thank you to our visitors today. We have some visitors with us in the UK Column studio, and they were able to travel quite some distance even though it was hot. So well done and thank you for coming.
Yes.
Well, let's go on to dark arts, and today is summer solstice. Of course, there will be some very unpleasant dark arts at work, and I think we're beginning to see what's really coming, the Conservative coup. And of course, it's been the UK column that has flagged this up from the start.
Well, it was quite amazing, Brian, that last week we mentioned that the Queen doesn't like this hat because, of course, this is Ascot week, so she wouldn't want to be wearing this hat today. She prefers this hat. Well, actually, we were wrong about that, because she didn't prefer that particular hat. She preferred this hat. So it is a EU flag blue coloured hat with some flowers on it with yellow centres. It looks a bit like an EU flag, Brian.
It looks a lot like an EU flag to me. This, I think, is mimicking the stars, isn't it? It's mimicking the EU ring of stars.
Absolutely, absolutely. So who is the Queen representing today? I'm not entirely sure, and we'll come on to that in a second. Well, of course, she was not accompanied by Prince Philip because he is in hospital. Apparently, he's perfectly all right. But he's in hospital today, so Prince Charles was there instead. And as you can see, they are both dressed for Royal Ascot, because that is the primary event of importance today, the horse racing, and not the opening of Parliament. So here we go. The question is, and I'm going to bring Alex in a second on this, was the Crown in Parliament? Because we cannot have a Parliament without the Crown in Parliament. She was not wearing the crown on her head. And the question is, who was she representing? Now, the crown, as you can see from this picture, was there on a nice soft cushion. But as I say, Alex, it wasn't on her head. And this is the type of thing you might see in the Netherlands.
That's right, Mike. When any Dutch monarch is invested, not crowned, they don't use the word coronation or bekroning here. They call it inhuldiging or investiture. Then the crown and the crown jewels are dumped into traditional Dutch ceremonial fashion, unceremoniously on a table in front of the king, and he doesn't even touch them during his ceremony, in which he not only swears an oath to the constitution to embody it, but he swears to obey the government. So he is an entirely Napoleonic construct. He is a mediatized monarch. Napoleon went round the Germanic states of Europe to the prince bishops and what have you, who had sovereign rights from the Middle Ages granted by Pope and people, and hoovered them up and said, you may keep all the gongs and baubles and you can just pretend to be sovereign. That's mediatization. The Dutch actually moved from being a republic in 1813 to back to be a monarchy, but of this kind. And this seems to be what's happening now, that the Queen is in distress or disgust or whatever, has laid aside the crown, which she's no longer wearing to embody the sovereignty of the British people.
I'll just add to that, Alex, that of course, I think it was about 5 years ago, but I had a telephone conversation with the palace. I spoke to one of the Queen's letter writers, and in that conversation, she admitted to me that our Queen had accepted mediatisation. That phone call was recorded. It was John Harris that first put out the recorded call. And it was John Harris who was the man who started to really investigate what this meant for the country, that our monarch should have accepted mediatisation. He was very quick to point out that what this meant is exactly what you've said, that she'd given away the power in order to keep all of the privileges, the money, the position and the social power, but her actual position as sovereign had been handed away. And of course, the conversation that I had with the palace was to do with where that power had been given, which was the European Union.
So I'm going to say that the crown was not in Parliament because it wasn't on her head, and therefore this is a Conservative coup. Now, this might seem quite strong for some people, but I think we've really got to ask what did take place today, and do we have a legitimate Parliament as a result? Now, Alex, the Queen is supposed to be the office holder of the Crown. There's some discussion about whether the Crown is a corporation sole or a corporation aggregate, because, of course, as you've said a second ago, the Crown is supposed to represent the sovereignty of the people. So, you know, what is your view on the fact that she was not wearing the trappings? Is this purely ceremonial? Is what's happened today symbolic of something, or is it actually has it actually, do you think, got any sort of serious constitutional ramifications?
We all have to use our own analytical judgment in there, Mike, because whenever you write a guide to the British Constitution, you are inevitably going to do, as people have done since the High Victorian ages, or mid-Victorian even, they inevitably put their own spin on it. So Dicey in the late Victorian era claims the Queen can do anything. Bagehot, the famous English Constitution writer of the 1860s, a generation before him, says the same. Basically, the Queen can make anyone she wants appear. So we have to put that aside and use our own judgment, bearing in mind that Elizabeth bears many hats, no pun intended. You know, she's many-hatted. She is Elizabeth Regina, Elizabeth, the head of secret societies through her and the menfolk of the royals, Elizabeth, the holder of money. In all of these roles, she does things for symbolic purposes and emotional purposes, and because of her sense of decency, and not to forget her very solid tuition and Christian convictions. And these don't go missing. You know, even if she is being held hostage or cajoled into doing certain things, she does things in a way which, to her mind, elegantly symbolise the position the nation is in. And I think that she may actually this morning have been thinking of that final verse of 1 Samuel chapter 4, which describes the name Ichabod. And the Ichabod was the name given to a child when the ark had been stolen from the Israelites. And the mother of the child Ichabod, the woman who gave birth to that child, explained the name as follows: "The glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken." Now, a crown symbolizes the glory of the nation. So the people have had their glory taken from them, and they've become ungovernable. They are being made ungovernable. And at some symbolic level, whether it's the Queen or her advisors, I think she is willingly or otherwise participating in this symbology to say that the country is no longer sovereign and is no longer governable.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. So let's come in at this angle now. We'll bring this back to the day's events in a second. But this New Statesman article here saying the consensus is that there must be an orderly transition, but Theresa May is finished.
Yes, the key quotation in here is that Boris Johnson is correctly identified by a serious, it's somewhat of the left, as you can see from the red type, and anyone who knows about the history of it will know it's largely been a Labour supporting magazine. So you can see it from that point of view, that it's the left's serious mouthpiece saying out with the Tory leader. That's party political level. But down the bottom here, we read of Boris Johnson that, quote, "Johnson may be lazy, duplicitous and inept, but he's not stupid. Hence the ferocity and very public nature of his denials after being put in the frame for either stalking horse or serious contender for Prime Minister." So there you are. You've got journalists realising that Boris Johnson is just what UK Column has consistently said he is, which is an extremely nasty piece of work.
Right. Well, look, let me explain why I put that in at that point, because the only other time that this has happened in history of this so-called dressed down opening of Parliament was in 1974, when frankly, the circumstances were quite similar to today. It's quite amazing, the parallels here. So in 1974, Harold Wilson was, as many have described it, he was struggling to save an embattled minority government. So he had a minority government. This was in March. And he was told by senior advisors that the Queen could choose a political outsider, as it was described, to be the next Prime Minister if he was to resign. And there was a memo produced which he described as the Blue Memorandum. And basically what it said was, the only circumstances in which the Queen could refuse a request to dissolve Parliament is if an alternative leader is available who could form a government which could command a majority in the House without a dissolution. And the memo went on to say, before deciding whether to grant your request for a dissolution of Parliament, we believe the Queen might consider it her duty to see if another election were avoidable. So there are a number of points here. First of all, it's clear that in 1974, if this memo is presenting a genuine state of affairs, at least the people that were writing the memo believed that the Queen would take it upon herself to actually engage in the process of government and decide whether an election was avoidable, that she would then appoint somebody else from the Labour Party, Harold Wilson's party at the time, to be the next Prime Minister if she felt that that person was capable of pulling together a coalition. And therefore there would be no leadership election within the Labour Party at that time. So, you know, there are many parallels between that time and today to be drawn. And again, I wonder, is this again symbology to remind people of the events of 1974? It's still unclear at this time, but I feel that what's happened today is pretty significant with regards to the governance of the country. I'm just interested in your thoughts, Alex.
Well, we could go right down philosophical rabbit holes, Mike, but we have other formats to do that. Lunchtime news, we try to keep it snappy. So I'll say this. It goes beyond the level of just symbology or keeping the nation psychologically framed. It is a moment of transition, which the phrase we keep hearing from our new third sector governors, which involves the constitutional wrecking of every Anglosphere country, every English-speaking common law democracy simultaneously. In 1974, Britain was the economic sick man of Europe, which we are again. We're being cabbaged by the Brexit negotiations because the way they're being run, Philip Hammond is at least right about this much, we're going to be left on the day after Brexit, if it happens, with no deals in order to trade with the rest of the world. We'll be impoverished overnight. So that's one side of the wrecking. This was the case in 74. Less than a year before 74, you had Watergate in the States, and less than a year afterwards, you had the Gough, G-O-U-G-H, Gough-Whitlam scandal in Australia, where the Crown, the same Queen Elizabeth, through her Governor-General, sacked the Prime Minister of Australia. Most Australians didn't even know that that was possible, including some serious constitutionalists in Canberra. So what was happening there was the Bretton Woods model had finished. It had been sucked dry. The dollar was no longer backable. Nixon left the gold standard, of course, in 71 in preparation for this, and a new model was found. In that case, it was the hydrocarbon reserves of the Gulf. They became the new sink to back the currency. Now, if you listen to Daniel Estelin on his AmericanFreePress.net interview with Mark Anderson, you will hear the same analysis that the Bilderberger model, the Anglo model, whatever you want to call it, of sucking the country dry with usury and inflation is completely maxed out. The parasite has taken over the host. And so there is serious panic, not on a constitutional level alone, or psychological or governmental, but economic. How are the businessmen going to continue to fleece us? They're going to have to make a transition, particularly in the common law democracies, which are the hardest nut to crack in this regard, a transition to a Germanic model, Platonic model of everyone working in the national interest for infrastructure, space-based economy. This is a very dark rabbit hole to go down. I can't go down it now, but basically this will be presented to us. You could call it Trumpism, whatever name you want to use for it, as the savior from the old system. But for it, we are going to need world government. So it's a coordinated Anglosphere-wide constitutional crisis.
Alex, we will spend more time on that issue because it is so important, but as you say, under a vehicle other than the news. I'll just add that, of course, we reported immediately after the election that it was Citibank that calmly said Theresa May will be going. So one of the banking institutions immensely confident in saying that Theresa May was for the chop. Well, on the subject of what I would say is treason within the nation, let's remind people that back in February 2011, the UK column was warning about the secretive meetings between Britain's military leaders and the French that were hosted with the help of the charity, so-called charity, the Franco-British Council. And we warned that this meant the end of Britain's military. This is part of the article. We are to be stripped of the military power to act alone. Our military command and control structures are to be weakened and confused by French collaboration and partnering. And we are to be stripped of nuclear weapons. The security of Britain is being destroyed under the cloak of Cameron's Franco-British Defence Treaty. And more in the article, but this is the key piece. We said, perhaps appropriately for deals done in the dark, Admiral Stanhope's shameful British collaboration was conducted in anonymous dark civilian lounge suits. So when Britain's highest military leaders were betraying the nation, they didn't wear their uniforms, they wore civilian suits. And I believe, Alex, that this was very significant because I believe these men were committing treason. They would certainly have been committing treason had they done these deals in military uniform, because they would have been representing the Crown, hence the change into the civilian suits. And I'm putting that as a supporting piece of information alongside the fact that the Queen did not wear the crown in her speech this morning.
Yes, right. Alex, Department for International Development has tweeted this out today. So still a couple of appointments being made to the cabinet, let's say, or possibly not the cabinet, but at least to the government. And this DFID tweet saying Rory Stewart and Alistair Burt have been appointed as joint ministers of state to the Department for International Development and the Foreign Office. I'm not quite sure I understand what that means. How can they be joint ministers in two different government departments? Is there a merger in progress?
It's a takeover. FCO in the last decade, when I was attached to it, its underbelly, would talk about joint ownership of outcomes. And the Department for International Development, which only got involved at the intelligence level and the cabinet level, really during the Blair II era, so early 2000s, and gradually encroached upon Foreign Office, so that cables were sent out, diplomatic telegrams from FCO to ambassadors saying, make sure you take ownership of these DFID outcomes. Now the tail is wagging the dog. If you look at the overlap, it's 50%. Of the 4 DFID ministers, the cabinet minister, Priti Patel, and the 3 underlings, one of whom is in the House of Lords, bit arcane for foreigners, I know, but that's how it works. 2 of them, that is the 2 MPs, who are not the Priti Patel, the minister, are in fact also in FCO. So they're double-hatted. And of course, they're very close to each other, these departments. But it means that Florence of Arabia there and Alistair Burt, the MP for North East Beds, including the constituency down in Arlesey, one of our faithful viewers who's often in the chat box, has a thing or two to say about Alistair Burt. They're going to be running FCO policy. So it's a takeover, because DFID, of course, is where we channel the money to destabilize countries, along with our media efforts in the same regard. Burt, when he was out during the first Labour landslide, 97 to 2001 Parliament, went and worked for a management consultancy firm. And earlier than that, in the Thatcher era, he was a protege of, I think if I'm not wrong, not Sir Keith Joseph, but Kenneth, I forget the surname, the education minister, Kenneth Baker, who was a particular brand of Toryism. So that indicates what's going on here. Companies, through under the mantle of humanitarian aid, are taking over our foreign policy, because they're going to get advance notice, or steer us indeed, to wreck certain countries, a good old American-German model in the Balkans, so that they can get the plum deals to reconstruct.
Okay, thank you for that. Now let's move on to this. Now I understand you've been in contact with this gentleman.
This is Ronald Barnard, although he's often just known as Ronald B on the internet. If you're looking for copies of his interview, please be aware that there's many mirrors, and he has in fact only brought out 2 parts of this amazing whistleblowing series. So if you see part 3, 4, 5, this is people's analysis, not the original. The channel you need to go to is called M for Michael, DMTV. That's the originals. They have Dutch plus English subtitles or English audio, a range of versions to choose from. And this is part 2, in which he explains that he was one of the 8 to 8,500 financiers who, by invitation only, and they bond by sacrificing children, at which was the point he had to leap out, he couldn't take it. But these 8 to 8,500 financiers give orders to the BIS. If you go to the British Constitution Group's website and look at the Winchester talks, or the YouTube mirrors, you will hear Justin Walker and indeed David Ellis talk about the BIS being the pinnacle, the apex of the financial system, which indeed it is. Ronald Bernard was above that level, and he explains, even using hand gestures to say, sitting above the pyramid, that BIS sits above privately owned central banks, some of which now are Europe-wide, well, continent-wide, like the European Central Bank, and maybe NAFTA will have one in the future, then the regular retail banks, then below them the multinationals, and the corporate communitarian agenda comes in at that level, but it serves right up the pyramid. And he talks about these two models of usury and deliberate inflation to thieve the money and make sure there's never enough in the system for everyone to repay. So that goes into phenomenal detail, and it's the first time that someone on the whistleblowing side of child abuse and really elite stuff has merged with one who has a sober analysis like Justin Walker's of the BIS and all its ramifications and money creation. I would say it's the keystone interview, and this series is he's promising to release parts 3, 4 and 5, which were recorded later by special demand. He's going to explain it in an extremely productive style. I watched it with my mother-in-law last night. She said she could follow every word of it despite having quite a humble education. So he's really getting through to the masses and centralising his focus on how the Netherlands and Britain are at the heart of this rotten Tower of Basel, and in fact planned the wars and artificially create shortage. When you talk about artificial shortages, a lot of people say, well, there isn't enough to go around in the world anyway, be realistic. But what he's talking about is the money level shortage, deliberately not enough money because of the interest being creamed off. So that is not a matter of just real world economics, it's artificially created shortages. And yes, Ronald Bernard is going to spend most of the summer on a tour, but he has intimated that he may want to speak to UK Column News, and he's following us with interest. So watch this space.
Okay, good stuff. Well, let's come to the City of London, because Philip Hammond was giving his speech yesterday to the Mansion House. This was supposed to take place last week, but because of the Grenfell fire, they decided to put it off, and they held it yesterday. So this was a keynote to Mansion House, which of course is the centre of City of London. He said that Britain would leave the EU in a way which prioritises British jobs and underpins British prosperity. I don't think so. He said our departure from the EU is underway, but ensuring that it happens via a smooth pathway to a deep and special future partnership with our EU neighbours, one that protects jobs, prosperity and living standards in Britain, will require every ounce of skill and diplomacy. So, Brian, every time we hear these people speak now, it's about smoothing a pathway to a deep and special future partnership. Partnership means membership, doesn't it?
Means membership. It also means collaboration, Mike. And I think the society that is very nearly constructed under the surface is communitarianism. It's a communitarian society that they're putting together. It's got the loose label big society, but it's very dangerous stuff. Wherever you hear the newspeak language, the use of these strange words, strange phrases, this is the route to communitarianism.
And also speaking at that Mansion House speech was the Canadian Mark Carnage, who is the Governor of the Bank of England, of course. He was really saying that Brexit was going to cause all kinds of problems. But he said, he was discussing interest rates. He said, now is not the right time to raise interest rates while wage growth remains anemic. So he's using what he describes as anemic wage growth as the excuse for not raising interest rates. Well, let's just have a look at this, because this organisation, the R3, saying that 1 in 25 UK businesses unable to repay debts if interest rates go up. And what this report is saying is that this is the Association of British Recovery Professionals. They're bankruptcy experts, and they've looked at the levels of corporate debt that are being held in the United Kingdom. And they're saying that if a 0.25% interest rate rise was to be imposed by the Bank of England, that 1 in every 25 businesses in the UK would go out of business immediately because they would find themselves in default. So that is a pretty staggering statistic, and I think that probably gives a better clue as to why Mark Carney cannot raise interest rates at this point. And if he comes back next month, if I remember rightly, the Monetary Policy Committee decided by 5-3 that they would not raise interest rates. We wait to see what happens next month, but we're looking at coming close to the end if this is the case.
Immense danger just under the surface, and of course not being reported by the BBC or any of the other major so-called mainstream press and media.
And Alex, the Financial Times here putting together a little video clip, I think this was about 3 minutes long, about the slow death of cash, as they're describing it. And Martin Wolf here, Bilderberger, I believe. Of course, he's wearing his purple tie because purple is the colour of kings and, of course, the colour of the new colour revolution that's going on. Does cash still matter, he asks. He's suggesting that instead of cash, people might be allowed to deposit safe deposits directly with the central bank of the country, thereby coming under the auspices of the Bank for International Settlements again, and saying that it's unavoidable because of the rise in global cashless transactions. This is a quite incredible little video clip.
It is, Mike, and it's interesting that the FT doesn't dare open it to comments. They've put it up on YouTube, and that YouTube video is available publicly. It's not a hidden link, but what they've done is disabled comments. But of course, when they tweeted out the link for coverage, they couldn't stop people commenting on that. And I retweeted it in surprise or disgust, and I found that the only comments under it, even after a couple of days, were by UK column viewers and like-minded people telling the FT where to shove their cashless society, which is a great step forward even from a couple of years ago. But here in the Netherlands and also in Denmark and so on, they're very close, or they're the spear tip of this agenda. They're very close to abolishing cash. But what goes with cash, or as it's derisively called in the video, an ancient technology? But what goes is the ability to help people charitably, for example, to stick some money in an envelope and say, here, I know you're having a hard time of it, particularly if those people are undesirable or enemies of the state. That's just one of the many ramifications of abolishing cash. You're being snooped on all the time. Your preferences, your sexuality, your relationship with your children is all laid bare if you don't have cash.
That's right. It is a bit ironic that they call cash an ancient technology when they are basing their entire energy policies on the ancient technology of the windmill. But anyway, the thing that they were particularly excited about, Martin Wolf was particularly excited about, was the fact that a cashless society would make it relatively easy for governments to collect tax.
Yes, and I love the open-mouthed amaze there, of his, he's posing as a king, as you say, with his scarlet colour, which common purposeites always like, and Bilderbergers. But we know, any number of people will tell us, such as Daniel Estulin, the Bilderbergers are in an absolute flat spin because they've reached the end of their model and they've got nowhere to expand on the entire globe. It's the open-mouthed amazement or breathless excitement is merely covering, the kind of panic. Here, you simple rubes, take what's good for you before it's too late.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just come in now on the subject of Grenfell Tower fire. And of course, what were residents being told? Well, really, there wasn't enough money to pay for proper fire-resistant cladding, although the residents knew what was available, but the cheaper option was taken. We've been told in the last 24 hours that aside from the 276 million in usable reserves held by Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council, that their unusable reserves are a mere £1.2 billion. And we'd like to thank John Hurst for that information. And of course, John Hurst from the British Constitution Group has been digging into this data, which shows that far from being short of cash, our local authorities have been hoarding cash, which they are hiding from the general public. And of course, we're now seeing the effects of this so-called austerity, a lie in itself. People die. A couple of days ago, I was able to interview a lady, a resident from the area of Grenfell Tower, Emma. This is a 5-minute clip of extract from that interview. I'll try and make the full interview, the full audio interview, available on the UK column as a dispatches later on today. But I think you'll be fascinated to hear what this lady has to say.
My connection with the area is that I went to school in the area. I went to a school called Avondale Park Secondary Modern. It was for them.
So take us on to the events around those tragic events around Grenfell Tower. When did you first find out that the tower was on?
I had on the radio, on a radio station that operates all night, giving you news. I heard the announcer said in the news, there's been a fire in Notting Hill. And I thought, what? Then I listened a bit closer and it said Latimer Road. And I thought, crumbs, I know there. And this was around 1:30 in the morning. And I said, oh God, should I go? Should I go? Should I go? So I changed my clothes, got in the car, drove up the M40. On the flyover, I was shocked of what I saw. I saw the building in flames. And the flames were so strange. It was on the sides of the buildings was the licking flame, like you put a blowtorch onto something, and that was coming down like in a V shape. And the building, inside the building, you could see inside every flat, and it was red hot. It was burning, and I just screamed out, oh Lord God, none of those people on those buildings, the top of the building, are going to be alive. None. And I couldn't see how any of them could escape because both sides, where should be a stairwell, which is a fire exit, you can see it on flames. So where are they going to escape? How are they going to escape?
Right.
And I just prayed, beat my chest and prayed with one hand on the wheel. And I drove down to the Paddington Slip Road to turn the car back in the opposite direction, which would be on the far left, going as if you're going towards Oxford. On the far left side, you can have a very good view of the building. 2:00 in the morning, there wasn't much traffic on the M40, so I was able to drive very slowly and look. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then there was stuff falling off as well. You can see stuff. I don't know if it was people or bits of fabric coming off the building. And then I drove down the motorway as if you're going to Westfield Shopping Center to look at the back side of the building. And you could see the same thing, licking flames. And that was it. And I came home. I don't know how I slept. I just prayed to God.
As we look at the situation now, I understand that many people are asking questions, particularly, and this is a very sad subject, but they're particularly asking questions about how many people did escape, how many people died, how many people are missing.
On the wall, there was a Filipino lady sitting, and I sat next to her, and there was a Spanish man on the wall as well. And I engaged in conversation with her, and I asked her, do you live around here? And she said, yes. And I said, where do you live? And she said, can you see the Grenfell Tower? I said, yes. She said she lived in a low flat, 2-story accommodation opposite the tower. So I said, oh, that must have been awful for you that night. And she started crying. And she said, yes, it was. And I just put my hand on her shoulder to comfort her. And then she continued to talk. And she said, the clothes I have on is what I ran out of the house in since that night. And she said, her sister was inside the sports center registering them to get accommodation. So I said, where have you been staying? She said, with friends. And I said, what happened to the flat? And she said, on the night, she heard screaming and sirens, and she thought there was a fight in the street. So she went and she looked out the window, and she couldn't see anything. And then she went to her children's window and opened it, and she said what hit her was smoke and heat. She said the heat was so powerful, and she had to shut the window quick because of the smoke. She woke the children up because she realized there's a fire, called her husband, tell them to get out of the house, and she rang her neighbors and told them to get out of the house. This was after 1 o'clock. Could you imagine? Nobody told them there was a fire.
Wow.
Until she opened the window, hearing all the shouting. And then she was able to alert her neighbors. They all ran out in the street, grabbed what they could, take the children, and escape. To her, how many people do you think live in that place? And she said, she didn't tell me how many live, but she said, I think there's about 500 people dead in that building. She said there's over 100 and something 29 flats. And she said there's families of children, families of elderly, families of single people living in that flat, and she lives there. She knows them. She sees them. So I've got to believe her. And she said the figures they're giving is so untrue.
That is an amazing interview. As I say, I will get the full interview up later today. But here we're hearing that local people saying that many people were inside that building, and we still have not got any real information coming out of the authorities. But we had the Sun newspaper yesterday trying to make excuses that the authorities weren't releasing the real known figures because of concerns over fake news. This is absolutely astonishing. We've got Simon Cowell now putting together pop songs in order to commemorate the fire almost, and yet we still have not got the true scale of this horrific incident out in the public domain. So there is much more to be told about this story. You will hear other comments about what was happening and the reaction of people, including that on Sunday when the local community came together, hundreds of people, many of them in their Sunday best, as a mark of respect to the people who had died in the tower, there was no mainstream reporting whatsoever. So there is something very strange at work. I'll just add here, since we have been talking about Sheffield, that there's been an announcement in the last 24 hours that Sheffield City Council is now going to install fire sprinkler systems in all its tower blocks. We find this very interesting after local people, of course, warning of the fire risk in Sheffield back in 2012, but also now reported by UK Column. And let's just get this man on screen again. This is Eric Pickles. Of course, Eric Pickles, Community Minister, was informed about the fire risk. He was one of a total of 4 MPs informed. He did nothing. But we'd like to remind people, of course, that his big drive is nothing to do with fire safety. It's to do with the fact that he's a revolutionary, bringing in this new communitarian form of government. With an eye on the clock, Alex, that is a very telling interview from that lady. She was very measured, but she said that it was quite remarkable to see people helping each other around the tower. It didn't matter what religion, Christians, Muslims, they were all there helping each other. Different religions, different races. None of that has been reported satisfactory in the mainstream media. I almost get the impression the BBC is disappointed the rioting hasn't already started as a result of the fire.
Well, this area, the Shepherd's Bush area, or gentrified now, it's given a new name of Notting Hill. Grenfell Tower is, according to some estate agents, in Notting Hill, which I don't accept. But anyway, that North Ken area is known for its West Indian population. And as you heard Emma say, I prayed to God. Almost to a man and woman, the older generation of West Indians are deeply committed Christians of various denominations, and that's why they won't appear on the BBC. I remember a few years ago, a Nigerian in Nigeria, in fact, escaped from a communal riot and said, I was saved by the special grace of Jesus Christ. And the BBC played it without comments. You know, you could see the noses turn up. Anyone who's got any kind of religious faith is not going to be mentioned, Jews, Christians or Muslims. As regards Islam, by the way, one of the reasons why, according to many reports we're getting now, dozens of bodies were in some of the rooms is because the iftar was happening, the breaking of the fast, and people from other areas were coming in. And of course, there may have been illegal immigrants cooped up in dorms in other cases through subletting. But a question for you with an eye on the clock, Brian. I shared a previous snippet from the London Black community on Facebook and Twitter of a lady saying, in a voicemail, rather like the one you played, saying, I fear that the numbers are being covered up of the dead at Grenfell Tower. And a kindly man, a former very high up at GCHQ, now retired, upbraided me and said, you're giving vent to fake news, Alex. This kind of conspiracy would involve all the firemen having to keep the numbers secret. What would you have to say to that? Is it requisite for all the firemen to be involved in a conspiracy in order for the numbers to be kept down in the media, or is that too simplistic a view?
Well, I think the answer to this question is very easy. Firstly, in the full interview with Emma, she does go on to say why she thinks that the numbers have been suppressed. And she says, I think the numbers have been suppressed to help protect Kensington Borough Council from the truth about the fraud and the corruption and the criminality within the council that helped create the fire in the first place. So that's why she says, do I think it's possible that firemen can be silenced from telling the truth? Absolutely. We saw the chief fire officer not standing in front of the cameras speaking from her heart about what she had seen and what she knew was going on in her fire incident. She simply read from a sheet of paper because that is what she'd been given as part of her media-friendly instructions. So police and fire service people warned not to speak about what they'd really seen, absolutely. And on Saturday, just gone, UK Column tweeted out that 50 people had been found dead. In fact, we didn't say the rest of what we knew, that they had been found dead in the stairwell. 2 hours later, Metropolitan Police were forced to admit that 58 people had died. We see time and time again that the government will use very draconian powers to silence anybody who wants to speak the truth, including, I'll just add, including, of course, when we talk about deaths within the NHS.
And the other point I would make, Alex, is that firemen and the police have not been quiet about this. When Lily Allen spoke to Channel 4 News, she made the point that police and firemen had been telling her what the numbers were. We have had reports from police and firemen about what the numbers are. So the police and the fire are not keeping this quiet. It's the media are not reporting what's being said. So it's an open secret amongst the people, the local residents, and amongst the people who attended. And I'll just say that one person that spoke to me a couple of days ago said that you know, she witnessed a senior fire officer with a lot of experience coming out of that building and clearly in extreme distress. So you know, there's nobody keeping this secret, in my opinion, other than the mainstream media. And when they lie about the numbers, of course, and others shout fake news, it becomes very difficult to get the truth out. We've just got to keep asking the questions.
Okay, well, if we talk about the silencing of people trying to tell the truth, we could have no better example than child abuse whistleblower Melanie Shaw. We recently put up a transcript of her letter from prison talking about the appalling abuse and the fact that she's been locked up in solitary confinement for most of a year in prison. In another letter which I've just had from her, one of the things she says is they keep telling us, she's talking about the other women that are in this on this solitary confinement wing, they keep telling us it's June the 10th. So this, in my mind, is psychology. It's very dark, evil psychology being used on these women. But of course, Melanie Shaw, whistleblower, trying to get the truth out about child abuse. And I'm also going to say we are fascinated that the UK Column has now come under attack from some elements of the gay community who say that we're not speaking out to support gay issues, and indeed we're not. And I'm going to respond, isn't it remarkable that UK Column over the last few years has stood by Melanie Shaw, who is herself gay, when we have seen no help whatsoever from Britain's so-called gay movement. So while people are pointing the finger at the moment from the gay community, my response is sheer hypocrisy. What have you done to help Melanie Shaw in prison?
Okay, let's move on. Defence. Well, this is Breaking Defence magazine. Here is our first shot of the F-35A on the ground at the Paris Air Show. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get time to check whether I had actually managed to take to the air at Paris yet. I don't believe it has, or I don't believe it will. I think it's probably going to stay on the ground. But the great news is, Brian, that the 56th Fighter Wing will or has resumed F-35 flight operations following an 11-day pause. We reported this a week or two ago because of what they describe as physiological events. Now, if you remember, what that means is that the F-35 had tried to kill its pilots by switching off the oxygen supply. And the statement from Brigadier General Brooke Leonard, who's the 56th Fighter Wing commander, was that no specific root cause for the physiological events was identified during recent visits from experts and engineers from the Joint Programme Office, Lockheed Martin, the Air Force Research Laboratory and other organisations. However, specific concerns were eliminated as possible causes, including maintenance and aircrew flight equipment procedures. So, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but I find this spectacular that this aircraft on several occasions spontaneously switched off the oxygen supply to its pilots. It was grounded for 11 days. They have not found the root cause, and yet this aircraft is now operational again. There must be political pressure coming on here, which is causing them to fly this thing in an unsafe condition.
Well, that can only be the answer, Mike. Obviously, what they're really looking for is some form of software bug that controls the oxygen supply system. They've got immensely complex digital system flying that aircraft. It is not working. And my goodness, this is an outrage, isn't it? At the moment, the whole of the British military is on hold because this aircraft doesn't fly. We haven't got the aircraft carriers. We haven't got these F-35Bs on board the aircraft carriers. And even if we did, they don't work. Outrageous.
Alex, did you want to make a comment on this?
A friend off camera has reminded me that there's real problems with hypoxia, insufficient oxygen supply with the F-22 as well. I think the Hornet is probably the last of the fighters the US has produced which guarantee good oxygen. And isn't it remarkable that the head of the Air Wing, 56 wasn't it, talked about physiological events? That's Soviet speak.
Okay.
Yes, instead of the pilots weren't able to breathe because they didn't have the oxygen. You're
Yes.
absolutely right, Alex. Another fine example of Newspeak. And we'll say to our audience, wherever you hear Newspeak, you can be sure that the agenda operating, the socio-political agenda, is not for the benefit of the wider public. We'll end there on this very hot day. We're lucky that we have survived in the studio. Thank you all very much for joining us. Can I say that if you're watching UK Column News live and you're not a subscriber, we need your financial support to do what we do. So please consider making a subscription or taking on a subscription and or making a donation if we are to continue to challenge the failure of Britain's mainstream press and media. We need your financial support. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.